Hello students and welcome to today's class. Today we are going to discuss a very important topic related to the diffusion of agriculture from the places where it got originated to those areas of the world from where we have the evidences. This lecture has been divided into two segments, and today we will be talking about the origin of agriculture in West Asia and its diffusion to other parts. And there are certain objectives of today's lecture. To understand the beginning of agriculture in West Asia is one of them. You will be also able to understand the different aceramic and ceramic Neolithic cultures, which means those Neolithic cultures who were producing potteries and those who were not producing them. Then we will be moving towards understanding the earliest village settlements, the discovery of several prehistoric agricultural communities in Southwest Asia has provided most of the evidence for the various theories concerning the origins of food production. The Neolithic era is considered the beginning of food production, as it was at this time that people throughout Southwest Asia began to settle in villages and rely on subsistence farming and animal husbandry for their livelihood. Nearly all of Southwest Asia entered the Neolithic period by 9500 BCE. The precise date is unclear though, and it persisted until 6th millennium BCE in Mesopotamia and as late as 4000 BCE in some regions of the East Mediterranean coast. Now first we will be talking about the changes in climate soon after the end of the Mesolithic period. During the late Vestral Glacier, which lasted from around 21,000 to 16,000 years ago, the climate in Southwest Asia was chilly and dry, as evidenced by deep sea cores and pollen studies. Moreover, 100 meters of sea level plummeted and parched steppe spread across the interior. Forests were confined to the eastern Mediterranean and Turkish shores, and temperatures rose sharply after 16,000 BCE. At the end of the ice ages, forests grew fast because the temperature was significantly colder and wetter. There were far more animal and plant species in many parts of Southwest Asia, making these regions ideal for the beginnings of the human settlements. In a commonly recognized account of the origin of farming, we find, because of its location at the crossroads of the Mediterranean, continental and the monsoon climates, the far eastern Mediterranean coast is home to a dynamic and diverse ecosystem. This transition from a continental to a Mediterranean climate occurred in the early Holocene, when average temperatures rose, forested areas expanded, and winter precipitation decreased. A large number of annual cereal grasses, which bloom and produce seed in the spring but go dormant throughout the hot, dry summer, dramatically increased the plant diversity. The cereals originated in the Western Hemisphere and later migrated to the Eastern Hemisphere. Meanwhile, hunter-gatherer communities may have unwittingly varied the flora by firing it during the dry season to promote new grass growth for the deer and other animals that depended on it for sustenance. It was around 12,900 to 11,700 BCE that the Younger Dryas cold snap, which lasted for 1,000 years, began, bringing colder and significantly drier conditions to southern Asia. This is primarily what prompted people to start cultivating emmer wheat, barley, rye and millet, the wild predecessors of modern cereal grains. Such changes either resulted in successful full-time farming or complete failure. and hunting and gathering communities have developed a wide range of responses to the climate change. They expanded into new territory, protect what they already had from rivals, increase the production of plant resources through invention, technology, or part-time farming, or even herd animals for companionship and sustenance. The younger Dryas brought cold, dry temperatures and protracted periods of acute drought to the northern portions of the Levant, precipitating a climate catastrophe. The widespread loss of forest cover caused by Natophanes devastated cereal grass and nut harvests, especially in the more desirable woodland regions. The population density of the landscape had increased by this time. While some may have left, others stayed and increased their exploitation of local plant foods. As part of this increase, they may have resorted to hunting and foraging for less desirable foods like hares. As a result, they refined methods of storage, cultivated cereals extensively, refined methods of processing their seeds, and were considerably less mobile. This was more of a response to changing weather patterns than a departure from traditional forms of subsistence such as widespread hunting and gathering. Some people in the northern Levant started cultivating wild cereal grasses approximately 9500 BCE to meet the rising need for food that had emerged with the end of the younger Dryas. The increase and consistency of winter rainfall within a few centuries brought for better climatic conditions and more agricultural prosperity. Dear students, now we will be talking about the early farmers in West Asia. Images of the early farming villages in Southwest Asia where people were growing wild greens to supplement their foraging meals are sketchy at best. Differentiating between societies that were trying out new crop varieties and those who were growing fully domesticated grains presents a formidable issue. As an example, fully domesticated grains do have a tough rushes, but this transition was influenced by a wide range of circumstances. It is possible that morphological changes were delayed because grain heads were beaten into baskets before they were fully mature. The introduction of new wild plants on a regular basis, especially in the event of crop failure, might also have this effect. The emergence of the tough rushes is not an indicator of impending change so much as it was the result of new methods of care and handling. Cultivation was well established by the end of the younger Dryas with varying collections of wild plants grown in various parts of the world. Separate communities grew rye, corn, emmer wheat, barley and oats. Growing figs around the Jordan River dates back to at least 9700 to 9000 years BC. Simultaneously, weeds that grow well in plowed fields began sprouting up in deposits in the villages. In order for most of the plants to acquire the mutations of non-shattering airs and increased grain size, many archaeobotanists estimate it needed between 1000 and 2000 years of systematic cultivation of wild cereals. Continuous sowing and harvesting would have been required for full domestication to take place. Otherwise, the domesticated plants would not have dominated the fields. It is unclear when the first cultivated grains were widely used. This process took place over many generations and in many different locations. Sites in the upper Euphrates Valley dating back to around 8500 to 8200 BCE contain the first examples of completely domesticated N corn and emmer. In subsequent ages, barley became a staple crop. Very few of these early harvesters had sturdy rachises, and even fewer originate from even older places where wild cereals were being cultivated. Many civilizations have been actively altering local habitats to maximize the availability of economically valuable plants for many millennia prior to complete domestication. Many sites like Abu Huraira in Syria as early as 10,000 BCE include evidence of weeds often associated with cleared fields. Plants like barley and N corn were moved from more favorable environments to others that received less water, and in some cases the relocated plants were even cured. Weeds became more common as farming methods became more intensive throughout time, and many cereal plants and fruit trees were used in these endeavors, and their origins may be traced back to the tactics of widespread plant exploitation that have been in use since the Ice Ages. Agriculture was not a revolutionary breakthrough, but rather the natural development of risk mitigation techniques that had been in use for a very long period. The development of the Neolithic settlements in West Asia is seen by the archaeologists happening in different periods. Pre-pottery Neolithic period extended from 10,000 BCE to about 4,000 years ago and was characterized by agrarian cultures that did not use clay pots. Throughout these millennia, civilization got randomly divided into two distinct groups known as A and B based on whether they mostly used cultivated or experimental crops. Now let us talk about these two different groups. One is often termed as the pre-pottery Neolithic A, which can be also ascribed as the Aceramic Neolithic, which means that these were those societies which never produced pottery. So, Aceramic Neolithic A, or so-called pre-pottery Neolithic A, lasted for around 800 years or 40 generations, from roughly 9,750 to 8,550 BCE. Nonetheless, this was a time of widespread social upheaval and expanding populations, and many pre-pottery Neolithic A groups might trace their ancestry back to the Natufians. Most of them were located in low-lying areas in the south, and only a handful like Jericho and Netiv Hagdud were larger than a few hectares and provided dwellings for hundreds of people. The people of these communities, known for their sophisticated food storage silos, inhabited semi-subterranean oval homes. Very few public buildings existed, suggesting that most people's social interactions were limited to the confines of their homes. Netiv Hagdud, located 80 kilometers north of Jericho in modern-day Israel, was a thriving community for around 300 years and provides evidence of an early phase of the transition. Around 30 families, or up to around 100 to 200 individuals, lived on a tributary of the Jordan River, where they picked wild cereal grasses with flint-bladed sickles and hunted gazelle, fish, and even ducks. They produced so much plant food that it was kept in little bins or storage areas. Barley, a cultivated grain grown in tiny fields on adjacent easily tilled soils near the alluvial plain, and a small freshwater lake was included among the seeds. The rashes or stem of the barley plants are rather tough. At least 4 hectares were occupied by the first permanent settlement at the location of the biblical city of Jericho. There was a Natufian camp near the Jericho spring, as early as 10,000 BCE, and soon after a permanent agricultural community was established. These people, who apparently had no way to make clay pots, began erecting fortifications around their settlements. A rock-cut ditch approximately 3 meters deep and 3.2 meters broad was surrounded by a well-constructed stone wall with a tower. Within Jericho's walls, clusters of beehive-shaped dwellings were also reported. A few thousand years ago, the political and economic resources needed to support the collective labor of wall buildings was unimaginable. It is unclear why walls were built, but protecting against rival groupings, fightings, or limited supplies is a likely explanation probably. The wall's potential use as flood barriers has been suggested by geomorphological study, albeit this interpretation is even contentious. Abu Huraira, located on a small hill near the Euphrates, dated back to 9000 BC. This was a settlement that quickly expanded to span approximately 30 acres. There was a time when gazelle hunting was a major activity for the locals of this area, and then within a couple of generations, beginning around 9000 BCE, people began to specialize on herding, domesticating sheep and goats. The village houses were constructed using mud bricks, square in plan, and connected winding alleys and enclosed courtyards. Floors were typically black plastered that were polished and sometimes adorned with red patterns in the multi-room homes. Each home was occupied by a single family. Abu Huraira was finally abandoned in about 6500 BCE. Farmers of the years 10,000 to 9000 BCE hunted various animals including gazelles, wild cattle, pigs, and even goats. The bones do not exhibit any of the recognizable morphological traits seen in domesticated animals. Evidence of high rates of immature gazelles at several locations suggests that these people were skilled, selective hunters. This practice of exploiting animals dates back to the Upper Paleolithic period. At Abu Huraira and elsewhere, sheep and goat quickly supplanted gazelle as the primary source of meat around 8000 BCE. But there are also indications that livestock like cattle and swine were coming under more and more direct human management. Sheep and goat domestication had progressed to the point that surplus males were being killed for food before reaching maturity, a typical mortality profile for managed herds. Circa 7500 BC, it seems that the local gazelle herds had been drastically reduced. This pre-pottery Neolithic A population did engage in some degree of subsistence farming on the alluvial fens where they lived. The prevalence of silos suggests widespread food and maybe even the trading of necessities between neighboring settlements. Possibilities exist that Jericho and other cities served as hubs for the trade of precious metals, minerals, and even other goods. Once again, floodplain farming was likely at the heart of economy, while hunting and gathering remained significant. At this point in history, inter-community linkages were becoming increasingly vital, both economically through trade and socially through marriage between previously separate communities. Some groups have community buildings for the first time, a trend that would spur these structures in subsequent settlements like Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. In Syria, on the west bank of the Euphrates, was a town called Muriyabet that the pre-pottery Neolithic A people inhabited between 10,200 and 8,000 BCE. It is likely that the original settlers were nomadic people who farmed barley and rye near the river and even hunted gazelles, much like the Natufians. By 9700 BCE, grains had become an increasingly major part of the diet, and the inhabitants were living in oval semi-subterranean homes similar to those of their counterparts elsewhere. Even 500 years later, people were still living in circular homes, but they were also constructing rectangular buildings, some of which served as community centers or warehouses. Near the northern Euphrates, at a place called Jeref el Ahmar, archaeologists have discovered evidence of human habitation as far back as 9200 BCE. The bigger rectangular dwellings again seem to serve a social purpose. Human skulls had been laid in the foundation deposits. The diameter of some of the buildings in Jeref el Ahmar can reach up to 25 feet. Initially, these were multipurpose community centers, but with time they morphed into single-use facilities that may have had cultic overtones. Wadi Fanan 16 is located south of the Dead Sea on two low hills. It has given around 30 clay-walled, partially submerged buildings, some of which flank an elliptical building with a mud plaster floor and a double layer of benches surrounding much of its width. Once upon a time, a roof was supported by massive oak beams set into post holes. Between 10,078 and 8,220 BC, the flooring and framework were renovated many times. The overall appearance is reminiscent of a honeycomb with smaller ovals and bigger ones interspersed among the larger ones. These buildings had a variety of functions, including burial and ritual events like feasting. These buildings represent a new societal norm among a population that was no longer nomadic but rather rooted in place. It is possible that this is the case since plastered skulls have been found under the flooring of homes in Jericho, and as separate crania have been unearthed as foundation contributions in other places. It appears that ancestor worship had been a significant part in agricultural communities, maybe because the deceased were viewed as protectors of the soil. There is evidence that widespread adoption of a similar set of religious ideas and rites throughout southwestern Asia began as early as the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, and that this trend continued in subsequent centuries. Now, coming to another aspect and time period, which is the Aceramic Neolithic B. Aceramic Neolithic B, which is also known as pre-pottery Neolithic B communities, emerged in the northern Levant and elsewhere circa 8750 BCE under milder climatic conditions after the Younger Dryas. During its 2500 years of success, pre-pottery Neolithic B expanded across the whole Levant and into the central Anatolia and Cyprus. There were both stationary and nomadic groups present in this extensive field of contact centered on agricultural and herding practices. In such a huge area with so many different climates and ecosystems, it was inevitable that economic life would vary greatly. Cereals provided nearly all of the calories for some populations. Some people ate lentils as their main source of nutrition. Ain Ghazal in Jordan, for example, was one such location where wild game constituted at least 50% of the available meat supply. By 7000 BCE, however, sheep and goats account for more than 3/4 of the animal bones. Then approximately 6200 BCE, an abrupt shift in climate brought on by an increased aridity, which may have been exacerbated by the results of farming without manuring and overexploitation of local food supplies, among other things. There are also remarkable human figurines made of clay that were originally displayed on a house platform, which may be proof of respect for ancestors. These changes over many centuries are sometimes attributed to a gradual shift in cultural continuity, but the truth is more nuanced. Complex, often localized population migrations, ever evolving patterns of social interaction, and past population explosion are all factored into the equation of change. For the most part, there was no distinct divide between farmers and nomads under the pre-pottery Neolithic cultures. A wide variety of people engaged in both agricultural and hunter-gatherer economies lived in this area, and only by the end of pre-pottery Neolithic phase, everyone transitioned to relying mostly on the domesticated plants and animals, and a new distinction between farmers and herders had emerged, with the latter often residing on the periphery of settled regions. The development of early societies would be profoundly affected by this differentiation. Because of the huge increase in the quantity of imported resources and exotic artifacts, after 8000 BC, many bigger settlements developed into trading hubs. Farmers were employing materials from Mediterranean and seashells from Red Sea, Sinai turquoise and Anatolian obsidian. Small clay spheres, cones and discs were employed by many communities to keep track of the goods exchanged due to the high amount of commercial activities. Some archaeologists think these tokens were the first step in the development of writing. Some method of decision making and authority exercising was necessary for the then relatively larger societies. As no evidence of formalized social ranks has been found at any of the excavated sites, it is likely that these civilizations were organized along familial lines, with birth and age serving as the primary criteria for determining one's status. With this, we have come to the end of today's lecture. I hope you have learned a lot from this lecture. Thank you so much.